Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Grab those reading glasses because it's time for another episode of Rock and Read. Today we will continue reading through My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. We're on chapter 16, Sweet 16, yeah! Chapter 16 is called MTV. Here we go. Despite such momentous news and the effect it was about to have on my life, my family had become the main focus of my concern, chiefly my second son Cody, the most free-spirited of all of our children. Sweet, sensitive, gorgeous to look at, he had all the confidence of a third child and spent his childhood with scabby knees and scuffed hands. He looked just like I did as a kid, only he was 10 times more accident-prone. He became such a regular visitor to the emergency room at the local hospital that they were on first-name basis. When he was 11, he was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, or ADD, and after a battery of tests, we were advised to place him on the now controversial amphetamine Ritalin, then commonly prescribed for ADD kids to help them focus. Having had plenty of personal experience with amphetamines myself, I didn't approve of Cody taking pills at such an early age, but we tried everything else, and this was a last resort. By the time he was in 7th grade, I realized we may have inadvertently given him a lifetime taste for drugs. Some kids at school introduced him to pot and speed. The first time I noticed the telltale glazed look in his eyes, my stomach did a flip. Memories of my own unhappy encounters with my father flooded my brain. I was suspended in an agony of indecision. Part of me wanted to yell at him, grab him by the shoulder, shake him, and tell him how stupid he was being. I could almost envision the effectiveness of using my belt. The other part of me wanted to buckle under, drop to the floor, and cry like a baby. I, of all people, knew what drugs can do, and I had a dreadful sense of foreboding that this was the start of something serious. In all the years I had been in the music industry, I had seen dozens of promising young people fall by the wayside. Not just famous rock stars like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison, but personal friends like some of the guys from Flow, and friends like John Belushi, lying cold in his grave. I didn't have a clue what to do. In my young son, I saw echoes of myself, of Joe Walsh, of all the people I'd known who were addicts, and I felt physically sick. I began driving him to and from school and picking him up from his friends' houses. I tried to talk with him, reason with him, and explain that I wasn't saying this just because I was his dad. I know the temptation, son, I told him. I know what it's like to be persuaded into trying things by your buddies, but you gotta fight it. Stand up for yourself and say no. If this sort of behavior carries on, we're gonna have to take you to see someone, to get some professional help, and you don't want that, do you? Cody would stare up at me with those big blue eyes of his and promise to never try anything again. I'm sorry, Dad, he'd say. I only tried it once and I didn't like it anyway. His answers stuck in my craw because they were the same I would have come up with. Even more poignantly, at the same time I was dealing with young Cody's problems, I had to drive my old buddy Joe Walsh to a clinic in Santa Monica for drug and alcohol rehabilitation after Don and Glenn decreed that unless he was sober, he'd remain in the fires of hell. Susan and I and Cody underwent some searing encounter sessions and family therapy. It was an extremely salutary experience. I seemed to be to blame for just about everything that had gone wrong in his life. I was either never there, or when I wasn't paying him enough attention. Maybe he was right. In the hope that Cody might find some release in music, I bought him a guitar. The next time I saw it, the guitar was leaning up against his bed, with the words, "I hate Dad," scratched deeply into its mahogany veneer. Tears prickled the back of my eyes. I knew I was to blame. I had failed as a father and as someone with the experience of drugs who had luckily never felt the barbs of addiction. I had been absent for much of his young life, following my dream at the expense of his. The guilt nearly killed me. Cody had always had that wholesome kid surfer kind of look, with his blonde hair and bright eyes. Now his eyes had lost their sparkle, and he seemed like a different child. It broke our hearts, not least because it felt like we were losing him. Amazingly, one of the people who helped Cody during this difficult time was Graham Nash's son. He had gone through similar experiences the previous year, but had come out on the other side. I had hardly seen Graham since 1974, when I told him I was joining the Eagles and wasn't going back out on the road with him and David Blue. But now, he and I were attending parent support sessions and family therapy meetings together, often at his house, to try to help our children find their way through the labyrinth of their youth. "Hey, buddy, you were once my big brother, and now your son's doing the same for mine," I told him one night, as we hugged each other warmly and tried not to break down. We leaned on each other a lot during that hellish nightmare, and once again, my respect for him as a person increased tenfold. I arrived to resume work with the rest of the band in January 1994, at the very beginning of our troubles with Cody. Now there was the added worry of what it would be like to be an Eagle again. Glenn and Don had been up to their old tricks. This time I was told there would be no attempt to sit down and try to write great new material together as we had in the past for fear of opening old wounds. Instead of a whole new album, they decided independently that we were going to record a live album, along with 3 songs the pair had written with collaborators, plus a 4th new song. The remaining 11 numbers would be a rehash of old hits like Hotel California, Desperado, Tequila Sunrise, Take It Easy, and Life in the Fast Lane, sprinkled with songs like New York Minute from Don's solo albums and In the City written by Joe Walsh. Elliot Snyder was to be the producer. Before, we had tried our hardest to recognize our strengths and limitations, but this album found us tolerating weaknesses, especially in those members who couldn't bring in any worthwhile songs. If we hadn't let them slip something mediocre onto the disc, they wouldn't have anything on the album at all. This was especially true of Glenn's Girl from Yesterday, written with his old friend and collaborator Jack Timpchin, who had everybody's eyes rolling. Don remarked when Glenn wasn't in the room that his song was not his best work and that any country singer from Nashville could sing it better. I agree, the song didn't sound very good, and it went down badly at our later gigs, so we eventually dropped it from our set. Most irritating, the 4th new song on the album was to be Love Will Keep Us Alive, the number written by Paul Carrick with Jim Capaldi and Peter Vale for the Malibu Men's Choir demo album that he and I put together. That which Irving had so scathingly rejected as not strong enough was suddenly deemed worthy of inclusion in the new Eagles LP. It actually became the single with the biggest airplay from the album. To add to my feeling of being abused, Don, Glenn, and Irving also announced that they had struck a deal with MTV for a live performance in April to be aired 6 months later. As a final insult, the gods told me they'd formed new business entities that gave them a majority position in the new companies, all but muscling me out. Don and Glenn were to be getting a much larger slice of the pie, while Joe, Timothy, and I were to share the leftovers. I took immediate issue with the deal and told Irving, "Hey man, this wasn't what the arrangement was with Eagles Limited. What the is going on?" Irving told me not to worry and arranged a meeting in his office. Joe and Tim were summoned in and left the building happy with the arrangement. Then it was my turn. I walked in to see Glenn and Don looking stone-faced. When they explained to me what they were planning, I was initially rendered speechless. When I finally found my voice, I said, "Well, wait a minute, guys. That's not what we've done for the last 20-something years. We always had equal shares before. Now you want double of everything else? What's changed?" Glenn sighed and formed his fingers into a steeple. "You know, Fingers," he said, as if explaining something to a child, "this band's like a football team. Some players are more noteworthy and more famous, and they can command bigger salaries, like a quarterback. Others are just defensive linebackers who play okay, but don't get as much money. Don and I feel we're entitled to more." Tears of disappointment welled uncontrollably in my eyes. I just couldn't understand the shift in their minds that turned a long-standing Eagle partnership into something they suddenly felt they owned more of. To my mind, it was self-serving gibberish. I could hardly believe what I was hearing, especially the fact that Glenn, who'd insisted right from the start that there be no sidemen, was the one who was telling me. Quite apart from the sheer unfairness of what he was saying, his analogy just didn't stand up. He was talking about high-rolling sports superstars brought into a team to pep up their game as part of some multi-million-dollar deal. He and Don hadn't been brought in. If anything, I was the one who had brought in to beef things up. Furthermore, in the 14 years when we hadn't been on the road together, neither Don nor Glenn had done any more for the Eagles than Joe, Tim, or me. They didn't perform Eagles shows or do Eagles promotions. They didn't sign any more guitars or photos or t-shirts than the rest of us. They concentrated exclusively on their solo careers, which had been independently successful and lucrative. Now they were claiming that because of their own high self-validation of their worth as performers since their solo success, they were suddenly entitled to much more than the rest of us. If that were to be the case, which I disputed hotly, then Glenn should have been paid far less than Don. Worst of all, when I tried to voice my concerns and air my grievances about it, I was stonewalled and told to deal exclusively with Irving, their manager, who was my manager too. I was, in effect, negotiating against my own manager, someone I was paying to represent me. But to me, it felt like he was representing Don and Glenn against me, and with much more at stake. It seemed to me the conflict of interest was insurmountable. In Irving's inimitable way, he ran rings around all of us. This is in the best interest of everybody, he told me. Don't get so upset. We'll see how the tour goes, and then we'll renegotiate. Don't worry, we can deal with your concerns for later legs. You know I've always looked out for you and your best interests. The rehearsal stage for the MTV gig in our planned tour was at Culver Studios in West Los Angeles, not far from where Susan and I and Kilo had spent our first 18 months in California. I arrived the first day feeling frightened and intimidated by the delicate situation our negotiations were in, and I didn't know how to behave. If they had wanted me to feel like a lowly Simon, then it was working. Thanks to their constant chipping away, I had lost all confidence in my abilities and even in my usual happy-go-lucky ability to smooth things over. Glenn and I had gotten along okay on the Travis Tritt video shoot, and we had seen each other briefly in Irving's office, but this was different. This was the official start of the resumption tour, and if I screwed up now, I knew all deals would be off. I was walking on eggshells the whole time. I felt like I had to say, "Yes, sir," "No, sir," "3 bags full, sir," to Glenn. I was unable to relax, and it showed, so much that halfway through the first day, while we were waiting for Don, who continually defied the specific clause inserted into the contracts about never being late, Glenn asked me to step outside with him for a minute so he could speak to me. Oh, I thought, the color draining from my face. What have I done wrong now? "Fingers, relax," he said, placing his hand heavily on my shoulder and giving me a half smile. "I want you to know that I don't harbor any ill feelings about what happened at Long Beach, and I really want this to work. I feel great about us getting together at this time, and it's okay. Just take it easy, then we can all relax and have fun." My nerves were undoubtedly getting the better of me, but I hadn't realized until then how much they were affecting everyone else. I wasn't sure if I could trust him, but his words lifted my spirits slightly, and I allowed myself to breathe a little more freely, at least for the time being. I tried my best to keep the atmosphere easy and show that I was a team player. I was always the first to arrive at rehearsals and the last to leave. I'd get there early and check my setup, instruments, and equipment with the road crew. I wanted everything I did to go smoothly. Mine wasn't an easy path to tread. I was still seething inwardly about the deals that had been foisted upon me. A big part of me wanted to walk away from the egos and the greed and be my own man. But like a battered wife, I was afraid to speak my mind and suffer more blows from Don and Glenn, and afraid of the life outside of this marriage. I didn't have any place else to go. Joe was facing his own pressures. He was fresh out of rehab and sober for the first time in decades. I couldn't tell if he was nervous about facing the intense scrutiny of the gods or had tremors from withdrawal from alcohol and drugs. But man, he was in a bad way. I was scared for him because a couple times, especially when he was trying to play some taxing new parts, he just couldn't do it. His hands didn't seem to have the dexterity anymore, and it was excruciating to watch him try. I started arriving an hour early to rehearse with him before the others arrived. We'd work on guitar parts during the lunch break or after they'd left. I did anything I could to try to help him practice his parts. It was strange seeing Joe like this. He wasn't the same old jovial Jose or Rubber Nose. When I had driven him to the Exodus Rehab Center at Marina del Rey, my car windows rolled down because he reeked of alcohol. I hadn't honestly expected him to make it. His marriage had broken up, his life was in tatters, and he couldn't seem to kick the habit. As his buddy, and with Cody very much on my mind, I tried to warn him that the only way he was going to be taken back to the Eagles was if he was clean. "Joe, I'm going to say the same thing to you that I said to Cody," I told him as he sat slumped dejectedly in the front seat of my car. "Nobody can do this but you, buddy. Unless you take control of the situation right now, today, then you might as well kiss the rest of your life goodbye." I was intensely proud that Joe had fought his demons and won. I only hoped to God that my son would be as successful. But man, I really missed the old Joe and his crazy sense of humor, not to mention his playing ability. In the end, we limited him to a few songs until he could find his way. He played very little at first, apart from a bit of slide on Get Over It and a flat-footed Nashville solo on Girl from Yesterday. During the recording process, Glenn and I handled a lot of the guitar parts and let Joe just stand at the back and play what he could. By doing that, we took some of the pressure off and he relaxed into it. It wouldn't be too long before he was back playing some of the best guitar he had ever played in his life. But in those first faltering months of his sobriety, it was horrible to watch someone so talented struggling with something that used to flow out of him so smoothly. When we eventually set up on Downstage and started playing together as a band, though, we sounded okay. We listened to the music we were making and thought, hey, this is going to work. Just in case it didn't, we had some serious backup. This was the first show I'd ever played with the Eagles when it wasn't just the five of us. All of a sudden, because Don and Glenn wanted to bring their own people in from their solo backup bands, we had a whole orchestra behind us, with violins in the works, plus another drummer, 2 keyboard players, and a saxophone/horn guy, none of which the Eagles had ever had. Horns? My father might even have approved. The only shock came when we all opened our mouths to sing. The magic that had come from years of working together, practicing our harmonies and our oohs and ahs in the locker room, had withered. All of a sudden, we sounded like 5 different voices without harmony. This was going to need some work. I don't think I'd ever fully realized the extent of our transition from an equal band to Don and Glenn with a backup group until we were in the rehearsal hall. The stage designer and production crew brought in a mock-up of the stage design that Glenn and Don had come up with so that we could see what it would look like on the tour. The model was 3 feet square with little white trusses and everything, just as it would be, complete with miniatures representing each of us to show where we would stand, how we would be lit, and what we would be doing. Timothy, Joe, and I gathered around to look at the stage design for the first time and were impressed. It had everything, right down to tiny mics and amps. When the models were added, though, I could hardly believe it. The little dummies representing Glenn and Don, the gods, were white, while the rest of us were black or dark brown. Nondescript players at the rear of the stage that the cameramen and the lighting crew needn't really bothered with. It was so ludicrous I had to laugh out loud. "Hey, Glenn," I said, still laughing, "how come you and Don are white and everyone else is black?" I had hoped there would be some silly explanation or that I'd latched onto some private joke that they were now both going to share. Don looked up at me without a trace of humor in his eyes. "You're not Black Fingers," he said. "You're just Rusty." Don and Glenn both broke out into laughter. The MTV gig was to be filmed on a Warner Brothers stage set in front of an invited live audience and carefully selected friendly media in the style of the popular Unplugged concerts. It would be filmed, edited, and broadcast later in the year to coincide with the release of the new album. When I arrived at the Warner Brothers studio, I was amazed by what I saw. A stage had been built inside the set with equipment towers, lights, and orchestra behind it. Chairs had been set up for the intimate concert, and the whole set was framed by a large, dark wall at the back. Behind this were parked 5 Winnebago trailers in a crescent shape like the circling of the wagons, each with its own bedroom, toilet, and lounge. They were all exactly the same size, year, and color to avoid dissension. Someone had laid a green, fake grass carpet outside each one with folding tables and chairs. The tables were laden with cold drinks, food, and chips. It was like a giant family picnic for everyone who had been invited on set to witness this historic event. There were record industry Mongols, famous faces, and media stars in abundance. Even the legendary Robert Hilburn of the Los Angeles Times, who is considered by many to be the greatest of all music critics, was there, and we happily posed with him for photographs before the show. Glenn was his usual cheery self. When I arrived for the first sound check the day before the taping, we started right at the beginning of Hotel California, but he interrupted and told me that we needed a special introduction, something the fans hadn't heard before. Okay, I replied. What are you going to do? Not me, he said. Come up with something. What we need is a new acoustic introduction to Hotel California. An acoustic version? Would that work? Just do it, Fingers, he said, not interested. Okay, when do you want it? I asked, relieved at least to have been given something useful to do. Tomorrow afternoon sound check at 3 o'clock, he said, half smiling to himself as he walked away. I felt like I'd been given a test. If I passed, I could stay. If I didn't, I was out. The pressure was immense. I went back to my trailer and sat down with a nylon string guitar and played around with it. That night at home, I kept working on it. The difficulty is that when you've written a definitive piece of music that you agonized over, it's pretty hard to come up with something different a few years later. I tried to think back to my original concept of the song, sitting at my beach house creating what Don had dubbed the Mexican bolero. If I was going to do that acoustically, I wouldn't use a steel string guitar, I told myself. I'd use something more Mexican in the mariachi tradition. I kept playing with it, trying to figure out how Joe and I could do the double stuff and not sound like imbeciles. I drew on my experiences at the Holiday Inn in Harvard Square in Cambridge, playing numbers I barely knew to earn a $5 tip. I had had to play the most unlikely songs on an acoustic guitar back then, so why couldn't I try something similar now? I finally figured it out, drawing on my free-form experiences with Flo to give me the courage to play around with the songs. Arriving at the sound check, ready to show Don and Glenn what I'd done, I took a deep breath. Glenn said, I'll play this chord and then this one, and Fingers, you just go for it. We tried it through once. I had to improvise a lot, but I'd never done that on a gut string guitar before. I'm not a flamenco artist. That night, as the cameras rolled, Don said, Go for it. After just one rehearsal in front of a crowd of fans who hadn't seen us play in 14 years and who must have been wondering if we were still relevant in the 1990s, I made up that new introduction for Hotel to shock them, and it turned out just fine. Don and Glenn never said a word, but I knew from their silence that they were pleased. That MTV gig was truly a Hollywood version of a live concert. Everything was make-believe, the stage, the backdrop, the sound, and our happy, smiling faces. The audience had been handpicked to show their appreciation. The critics had been smooshed into believing that we were still valid and viable. After Glenn announced to the hopeful fans, we didn't break up, we just took a 14-year vacation. We played 90 minutes of songs from our most enduring body of work, plus the 4 new tracks to a rapturous reception. The Hell Freezes Over tour began on May 27, 1994. I thought ticket prices were set very high. Like me, Timothy and Joe had no say in the pricing. Irving claimed that others before us had set the precedent, and that this was the way to beat the ticket scalpers. Despite the exorbitant cost, the tickets sold within hours, and we played to sell-out crowds, while the media went crazy and Eaglemania took off big time. We suddenly realized what a remarkable phenomenon we'd become in our absence. Our first show was at Irvine Meadows Amphitheater, which Irving part-owned south of L.A. near Newport Beach. We were driven out there in a convoy of limos to our hotel. Among our security staff still working for Joe was Smokey, who had supposedly been on the White House security staff through 4 presidents. He still had a Secret Service badge, and he would flip it out whenever we arrived somewhere so that the local police and security people would goose-step to his marching orders. He was a very nice guy. On the way to the Four Seasons Hotel in Newport Beach on that first tense evening, I suddenly had a prickling feeling in the back of my neck in the limo. Psycho Santa stole into my thoughts out of nowhere. Hey, Smokey, do me a favor, I said. Phone the hotel and ask if there's a guest booked in under the name of blank. I gave him the guy's name. Smokey called the front desk, and as he received the reply to his question, he looked at me with an expression on his face that said, How did you know? I explained about the restraining order and what Psycho Santa had been up to. Now it looks like he might be waiting for me at check-in, I added. This is too freaky, man. Notify security at the hotel. I want him out of the place. And I don't want him at our shows either. If he has a ticket, tear it up. I don't want that lunatic anywhere near me or my family. If Psycho Santa had just sent me his stuff as I had asked, none of this would have happened. He could have sent it by courier if he was worried about it being lost or stolen. I'd happily have signed everything and sent it back and been done with him. Instead, he was freaking me out, not to mention the rest of the band. Not since John Lennon had been shot dead had I felt so paranoid. We reached the hotel, checked in, and moved as one to the elevator, flanked by security. The doors opened, and there, right in front of me, stood the man I knew as Psycho Santa, about to be thrown out of the hotel by 2 security guards. Our eyes met briefly, but nothing was said. In my mind, I wanted to say, "You're not going to do this to my wife. I'll sign your stuff, just send it like everyone else." Instead, I silently stepped aside to let him pass, and watched as he was marched out. That was the last time I ever saw him. I got the band to hire me a security guard after that from a company called the Purple Gang out of Detroit. His name was Johnny Sampson, and he became a dear friend. Not only could I sleep easy at night, but having him with me all the time diminished a great deal of the boredom of being on the road. I had a suite, and he'd be right next door, ready to protect me if necessary. It was intensely reassuring. In the end, everyone hired bodyguards. We were getting much more exposure than we had in the 70s, what with DVDs, live simulcasts, MTV, and the sheer size of the shows we were doing. None of us knew what might be waiting around the corner. Even with Psycho Santa out of the equation, the professional autograph hunters continued to hound me. There'd be droves of people waiting outside venues, gigs, and hotels with stacks of stuff for me to sign. At first I thought, hey, this is cool. I must be really popular. They're calling for me by name. Now I know how Elvis felt. I soon realized that it had nothing to do with my popularity. They weren't genuine fans. They were businessmen, and I was the missing link. Their stuff wasn't nearly worth as much unless they had my signature too. In Berlin, we were en route to our next gig in the convoy of limos early one morning when the driver of our car suddenly stood on the brakes. A driver had overtaken the convoy along a freeway and pulled in front of us before jamming on his own brakes, forcing us to stop. We screeched to a halt, very nearly rear-ending them. 2 guys jumped out of the car and ran back toward us. "Get down! Get down!" Johnny Sampson screamed to me, pushing my head to the floor with one hand while he reached for a weapon with the other. We didn't know what was happening. Was I being kidnapped or assassinated? I lay on the floor terrified as these 2 guys ran to the locked car doors and yanked fruitlessly on them. Looking up, I suddenly recognized them as a couple of professional autograph hunters who had been waiting outside our hotel for days and had already been shooed away by Johnny after I'd signed 1 item each for them. Realizing we were leaving town, they'd come up with their daring plan to get to me before it was too late. They each carried not weapons, but stacks of photos for me to sign, which they waved hopefully through the windows. Johnny, as angry as I was, told the German driver, "Drive, drive, schnell, schnell." To the 2 guys' dismay, we backed up at speed and took off. They totally freaked me out. The opening number of each performance on that tour was still Hotel California. On the first few gigs, we tried to sing Seven Bridges Road in the shower room again in a nostalgic attempt to recreate our magical early days, but our voices simply weren't up to the task. The magic was no longer there. We never tried again. Instead, we'd walk straight up onto the stage, take our places in the semi-darkness, and await our cue. I'd be standing at the front, my Gibson in my hands, ready to play the opening bars, the rest of the band behind me watching, waiting to launch themselves with me down that dark desert highway. Only this time, it was different. Thanks to the input of Don and Glenn working with a stage designer, pyrotechnics, and lighting, had transformed our set. Instead of us silhouetted against the photo of the Beverly Hills Hotel as of old, we were silhouetted by strobe lights while rolling thunder crashed overhead. It was a dramatic attempt to drag us into the 90s and silence the many critics who had accused us of being boring in the past. My cue to start the show was taken from a guy in the pits who wore a special glow-in-the-dark glove and headset. He'd hold up his luminous fingers one by one, counting us in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And as soon as a big clap of thunder had died away, I'd play the distinctive opening chords, timing them perfectly with a massive flash of lightning. It was all very impressive, and the crowds were instantly energized. Even after our long absence, or perhaps because of it, the fans went wild. Just as it had always been, as we walked on stage, the place would be lit with candles and lighters, and there'd be this whistling and humming, and an overwhelming buzz of expectancy. Waves of energy, excitement, and sheer adoration washed over all of us from the auditorium and made us temporarily forget the rifts that still tore us apart. The music was what it was all about. Night after night, we played to capacity crowds who only wanted to hear our songs. By the time all the thunder and lightning had finished and we played the first notes of Hotel in a dispersing cloud of cord-eyed smoke and blue light, the place would come unglued. We were on the road that November doing 4 gigs a week when we learned that Hell Freezes Over had opened at number 1 on Billboard's album chart. It ended up being certified 6 times platinum, with sales of more than 6 million. Even we had to admit that it was a remarkable achievement in an era of Oasis, R.E.M., and Nirvana. The tour expanded accordingly. My concern over the sharing of profits had still not, in my opinion, been properly addressed, and every time I spoke to Irving about it, he tried to deflect me. "When are we going to revisit this 17/27 deal as you promised?" I'd asked him. I know, he'd say, busying himself with something else. "Well, Don's happy to talk about it, but Glenn still has some issues. I'll get back to you." Nothing more was ever said or done until I finally dropped in on Irving in his hotel suite halfway through one leg of the tour. Angry at being blown off with excuses, bitter at the unfairness of the deal, and sick and tired of endlessly waiting for answers, I walked in bristling and said, "Hey, Irv, when are we going to address this?" Irving sat behind his desk and glared at me through his oversized spectacles. With a deep sigh, he said in words delivered with slow deliberation, "Don Henley will never give you a dime more than a seventh." He made it clear that he was not able to negotiate on my behalf. Even though Irving was my manager, it felt to me like he was Don Henley's man first and always had been. He allied himself to the one he believed would be the cash cow, and there was no budging him. Furthermore, he warned me that if I even spoke to the gods about this, especially Glenn, he could explode, and the whole tour might be canceled. I was sorely tempted to quit right there, even knowing that I'd almost certainly be sued for breach of contract. I knew I'd get no support from the others, although I felt like I was fighting for their interests too. Timothy was making more money than he had ever made in his entire life. Though getting stronger each day, Joe was still on shaky ground. He was unable to walk out of his hotel room without holding on to Smokey at his side. The machine was already up and running, and the message from the gods was clear. It was their way or the highway. I had no choice but to swallow my pride and move on. Well, that's the end of Chapter 16. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 16 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.